Prison industrial complex, the system, the industry, it is a beast. It eats Black and Latino people for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Minorities, people of color, the people of the majority. These are the people that are preyed on by the criminal justice system in America. Just like all of you, I had to do my project on 2 movies to expand my knowledge and understanding of the experiences of the people of the global majority. The movies that I chose are The Innocence Files and 13th, which both relate onto the topic of the injustices within the criminal justice system in America. In the 13th Amendment, there's a loophole that essentially allows slavery if you are a prisoner. Due to this circumstance, the loophole was exploited after the Civil War, and many African Americans were arrested for extremely minor crimes, such as loitering. Then, being prisoners, they were once again used for labor since the 13th Amendment technically allowed it. This is how the country rebuilt its economy following the war. Legal slavery. The 13th documentary brings out the prison system as the greatest shame of the US since independence. American prisons are portrayed as a system that has robbed African Americans of their dignity and the root cause of the most injustices against the people of color. The film portrays the current mass incarceration as worse than slavery that was being practiced before the 13th Amendment. After viewing the film, my personal perception of prison has changed from them being simple correctional facilities to now being dens of injustice for people of color. To truly understand the effects of mass incarceration, we have to return to where it all started. In the early 1970s, the baby boom generation were now adults, and thus because of sheer demographic change, crime rates were on the rise. It became very easy for politicians then to say that the civil rights movements at the time were contributing to the rising crime rates, and thus they criminalized them, to snuff them out and silence them. And with the Nixon era of law and order is where the word crime began to stand in for race.
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Midway through the 1980s, the war on drugs is already underway. Then, all of a sudden, comes along a new drug, crack cocaine. Drugs like this were likely to take over communities, and especially the poor communities of color at the time, because they can be sold in very small doses and are relatively inexpensive. In record time, Congress established mandatory sentencing on crack, and drug penalties for crack were harsher than the penalties for powder cocaine, even though they were essentially the same drug. In no time at all, communities of color were disrupted by the fact that tens and thousands of black men were disappearing into prisons by the month, being ripped away from their families and receiving incredibly harsh sentences. The 1994 Crime Bill. That crime bill was responsible for a massive expansion of the prison system, and beyond that, it provided all kinds of money and incentives for the law enforcement to do a lot of the things that we would nowadays consider abusive. Bill Clinton also introduced mandatory sentencing, taking the discretion away from the judges, arguably the most neutral party of the court, and giving it to the prosecutors. Did you know that 95% of elected prosecutors in the United States are Caucasian? Clinton also passed the Truth in Sentencing law that kept people imprisoned for 95% of their sentence without the chance of parole. In the land of the free, it's ironic that they have the highest incarceration rates in the world. The United States makes up 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's prisoners. It's hard to speak up against prison labor as it has become so heavily monetized. A company named Unicor does about $900 million in profit annually. How do they do it? Prison labor. Partnerships between correctional industries and private businesses are a rapidly growing segment of a multi-billion-dollar industry in America. We talk about sweatshops in China and cringe at them exploiting poor, almost free labor. But we don't realize it's happening here in America. Every day we have corporations who are now investing in free labor. It's everywhere from sports, fashion, to furniture. Federal inmates are building all of these things. They're profiting off of their punishment. Brands such as Victoria's Secret and JCPenney have switched suppliers once they were exposed for exploiting inmates, and now profiting off of them. Prison industries have gotten so big that it's very difficult now just to try to do away with them. Not everyone goes to trial. If every single person had a trial, the entire justice system would collapse. It often comes down to a plea deal and going to jail for 3 years, or you can go to a trial and have the chance to take 30 years if you lose. As a result, 97% of people do not go to trial and instead take a plea bargain. The tragedy of Kalief Browder, the 22-year-old New Yorker who committed suicide after being held in Rikers for 3 years awaiting trial on charges of having a stolen backpack. The charges were ultimately dropped. Browder's courage is evident in his refusal to accept a plea bargain for something he did not do. Yet the violence he faced during his imprisonment, and some of it even captured on film, led him to take his own life after release. The film also presents a thoughtful, searing discussion among the black scholars and activists about the ethics of visualizing this black suffering, from the past of lynching to the present in contemporary killings by the police. The first episode of The Innocence Files begins with Courtney Smith, age 3, a young girl reported missing in Mississippi on September 15, 1990. Courtney was later found by police floating in a pond. Amongst other wounds, bite marks were the main injury pointed out on her cadaver. Dr. Michael West, a forensic dentist, took impressions of 12 different black men on behalf of the prosecutors. LaVon Brooks was set as a primary suspect due to the sister of the victim, Ashley Smith, saying she had seen a man with a similar earring that night. January 15, 1992, LaVon Brooks court hearing. He's charged with capital murder. LaVon had many witnesses of where he was at the time, but it was no use against attorney Forrest Goodall. He was a highly persuasive attorney, and the fact that he had one of the sisters, 6 years old at the time, they were adamant they saw LaVon Brooks that night. That parted with the teeth mark analysis for evidence. LaVon Brooks was found guilty and given a life sentence. May 1992, 4 months after LaVon Brooks was sentenced to prison, 3-year-old Christina Jackson was deemed missing. When Christina's body was found, injuries on her corpse were incredibly similar to that of Courtney's. 2 days after the body was found, Kennedy Brewer, the mother's boyfriend, was immediately suspect number 1. Kennedy Brewer was offered a plea deal, but he didn't even entertain the idea of pleading guilty and turned it down immediately. He insisted on a trial to prove his innocence. I found it interesting that the Noxubee County Police Force didn't even bother questioning anyone else other than Kennedy. They didn't even bother to look any further than him. Again, the state used bite mark evidence as the main part of their case. Dr. Michaels also made a return, and Kennedy Brewer was prosecuted as guilty and given the death penalty. The second episode introduces forensic DNA science, which was the real start of the Innocence Project. They confirmed that Kennedy Brewer was not in the DNA of the semen that was tested in 2001. It wasn't that simple, of course, with Forrest Goodall determined to keep that man in jail. Forrest Goodall pushed for a retrial, so the Innocence Project formally represented Kennedy Brewer in this retrial. Also in this episode, the Innocence Project revisits the crime scene. They evaluate on how easy it would have been to go through the window and grab Christine Johnson. They also look into the bite mark. Christine was thrown into a pond nearby, which was full of crawfish. The Innocence Project tested the stillborn pig amongst the live crawfish, and the bites produced were oddly similar. Of course, reopening the investigation brought the Innocence Project into other similar crimes, which brings them to Lavon Brooks. The deeper the Innocence Project dug, the easier it became to prove Lavon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer did not commit those crimes. We learned that Courtney's sister's questioning was coerced by the interrogator. The young sister was saying the most outlandish statements that didn't even seem to make sense. We also learned that another suspect, Justin Johnson, was dismissed even though he committed home invasions and attempted sexual assaults in the same community. But because they were focused on teeth marks, he was excluded from the process. When the Innocence Project reran the evidence with new forensic techniques, they found the convicted felon Justin Johnson matched all the DNA, and Kennedy Brewer matched none. 2 confessions later, Kennedy Brewer and Lavon Brooks were freed in a special hearing. Wrongful convictions harm far more than just one person. They expand the suffering for the victims by delaying their justice. They traumatize new people like loved ones of the innocent men and women behind bars. They even allow actual perpetrators to get away with more crimes. If the bite mark evidence in the first case hadn't been so faulty, the second murder may have never happened. In conclusion, the United States justice system has led to some good people being portrayed as thugs, the loss of innocent lives from police brutality, the disruption of many colored communities, and inmate exploitation for free labor. It may look hard to achieve equality and fairness despite one's color and ethnic group. However, with the correct policies and everyone on board to speak up against racism, the next generation may not have to suffer at the hands of an unjust justice system.